A baby shower,
Congratulations, Elena. You
30
look
guests,
absolutely
pink and gold
radiant.
decorations everywhere.
Thank you so much
She
for
was 9
coming.
months
We're so
pregnant,
excited.
surrounded by people who loved her, married to a man worth $200 million. And then the doorbell rang. The woman who walked through that door would destroy everything. Her marriage, her future, and the baby she had been carrying for 9 months. What happens when you lose your child,
This evidence
your
confirms
husband,
everything
and
we
your entire
suspected.
life in a
If
single
we combine
afternoon?
our resources, we
Most
finally
women
have
would
the
break.
leverage we need to move
Most women
forward.
would disappear.
I understand your
Elena
position,
Mitchell
but this
did
affects
something
more than
else.
just me.
She fought back.
If you let this go through, I
But
promise
here's
you won't
what the
regret it.
billionaire family
We can still
who
make this
destroyed
work.
her didn't understand. When you take everything from someone, you also take away their fear. And a woman with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous enemy you will ever face. This story will make you cry. It will make you angry. And by the end, it will make you believe that justice is still possible. Stay with me until the very last word. Because the ending, you will never see it coming. The baby shower was everything Elena Mitchell had ever dreamed of. Soft pink and gold decorations hung from every corner of the Manhattan penthouse, catching the afternoon light that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. 30 guests mingled among tables laden with finger sandwiches and champagne flutes. A three-tiered cake in the shape of a bassinet stood as the centerpiece, its delicate fondant flowers spelling out a single name, Grace. Elena stood at the center of it all, one hand resting on her swollen belly, the other accepting yet another gift wrapped in pastel paper. At 9 months pregnant, she practically glowed. Her dark hair fell in soft waves around her shoulders, and her white maternity dress hugged the curve that held her daughter. Her daughter. Even now, after 8 months of feeling those tiny kicks and hiccups, the words still made her heart swell with joy she could barely contain. She had given up her career for this moment. Not that she regretted it. She had been a kindergarten teacher at a small private school in Brooklyn, the kind of job that filled her soul even as it emptied her bank account. She had loved those children like they were her own. But when Marcus proposed 7 years ago, when his struggling tech startup was nothing more than a dream and a maxed-out credit card, she had believed in him. She had supported him through every failure, every setback, every sleepless night spent coding in their tiny apartment. Now Carter Technologies was worth $200 million. They lived in a penthouse that cost more than she would have made in a lifetime of teaching. She drove a Mercedes and wore designer clothes that still felt foreign against her skin. But Elena had never cared about the money. She cared about family, about building a life with the man she loved, about the daughter who would arrive any day now, completing the picture she had been painting in her heart since she was a little girl herself. Marcus appeared at her side, sliding his arm around her waist with practiced ease. At 38, he was still devastatingly handsome. Dark hair with distinguished touches of gray at the temples, sharp jawline, eyes that could charm investors and competitors alike. He wore success the way other men wore cologne, and it clung to him just as persistently. He tapped his champagne glass with a small silver spoon, and the room fell silent. Elena smiled up at him, her eyes already glistening with happy tears. She knew what was coming. Marcus had always been gifted with words. It was part of what made him such an effective CEO. He could sell ice to Eskimos, her mother always said. He could make anyone believe anything. The thought flickered through her mind and was gone before she could examine it. Marcus cleared his throat and began to speak. "To my beautiful wife, Elena," he said, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "You believed in me when I had nothing. You stood by me through every failure, every setback, every sleepless night. And now we're about to welcome our daughter into the world." He paused, looking down at her with an expression that seemed to hold everything she had ever wanted. "I don't deserve you," he continued. "I never have. But I promise to spend the rest of my life trying." The guests applauded. Elena blinked back tears and rose on her tiptoes to kiss him. His lips were warm against hers, familiar after 7 years of marriage, and yet somehow distant in a way she couldn't quite name. Across the room, Rachel Torres watched the display with an expression she was careful to hide behind her champagne glass. She had been Elena's best friend since their freshman year at NYU, back when Elena was an idealistic education major and Rachel was a pre-law student with more ambition than sense. Now Rachel worked in human resources at Carter Technologies, a job she had taken 3 years ago when Marcus offered her twice what she was making at her previous firm. It had seemed like a gift at the time, a way to stay close to her best friend while advancing her career. But lately, Rachel had begun to wonder if the gift had strings attached that she couldn't see. She had noticed things at the office, whispers that stopped when she walked into a room, late nights that Marcus claimed were investor meetings but never appeared on his calendar, and a name that kept showing up in places it shouldn't. VS Rachel didn't know who VS was. She had tried to find out carefully, quietly, without raising suspicion. But the Carter family had a way of making inconvenient questions disappear along with the people who asked them. She should tell Elena. She knew that. Every time she looked at her best friend's glowing face, her swollen belly, her complete and trusting happiness, Rachel felt the weight of her silence like a stone in her chest. But she didn't have proof, only suspicion. And what if she was wrong? What if she destroyed Elena's happiness, her marriage, her family, over nothing more than whispered rumors and a set of initials? So Rachel said nothing. She smiled and clapped with everyone else. She told herself she was protecting her friend, not betraying her. But somewhere deep inside, she knew that wasn't entirely true. The doorbell rang. The sound cut through the celebration like a knife through silk. Elena looked toward the entrance, confused. The caterers were already here. The guests had all arrived. She wasn't expecting anyone else. Marcus's face changed. It was subtle, so subtle that Elena almost missed it. A flicker of something behind his eyes. Fear? Surprise? Recognition? The expression was there and gone in less than a second, smoothed over by the practiced mask he wore so well. "I'll get it," he said. But he didn't make it to the door. It opened before he could reach it. And everything Elena Mitchell thought she knew about her life came crashing down around her. The woman who walked into the penthouse was beautiful. That was the first thing Elena noticed, even before her mind could process what was happening. She was perhaps 29, with honey blonde hair and features that belonged on a magazine cover. She wore a form-fitting red dress that should have been inappropriate for a baby shower. But it was not the dress that made the room fall silent. It was her belly. The curve was unmistakable. Not as pronounced as Elena's own, but visible enough that there could be no doubt. This woman was pregnant, perhaps 3 months along if Elena had to guess. Early enough that she could have hidden it if she wanted to. She clearly did not want to. The woman walked straight toward Marcus. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor. Each step deliberate, each movement calculated for maximum impact. She moved like someone who had rehearsed this moment, who had planned every detail down to the angle of her chin and the slight smile playing at the corners of her lips. Marcus stood frozen. He didn't say, "Who are you?" He didn't say, "You need to leave." He didn't say anything at all. He just stood there, caught. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Elena watched, her mind refusing to connect the dots that were arranging themselves in front of her with devastating clarity. There had to be an explanation. There had to be some reason why this beautiful pregnant stranger had just walked into her baby shower and was now standing inches from her husband with a look of possession in her eyes. The woman spoke first. "I'm tired of hiding, Marcus." Her voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried easily in the silent room. "I'm tired of being your secret. You said after the baby was born, you would tell her, but I can't wait anymore." She placed one hand on her belly. The gesture was deliberate, territorial. "Our baby deserves to have a father who isn't ashamed of us." The room stopped breathing. Elena felt the words hit her like physical blows, each one driving deeper than the last. Our baby, as if this woman and Marcus shared something that belonged to them alone, as if the child growing inside Elena was somehow less real, less important, less wanted than whatever was growing inside this stranger's womb. She turned to Marcus, her husband, the father of her child, the man she had loved and trusted for 7 years. "Marcus?" Her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Who is this?" He didn't answer. "Marcus, who is this woman?" Still nothing. His face had gone pale, his jaw tight, his eyes darting between Elena and the stranger as if calculating odds, weighing options, searching for an escape route that didn't exist. The woman answered for him. "I'm Veronica Shaw. I've been with Marcus for 2 years. I'm his executive assistant, and I'm 3 months pregnant with his child." She smiled. The smile was the worst part. There was no guilt in it, no shame, no hesitation, only triumph, pure and undisguised, as if she had just won a contest that Elena hadn't even known she was competing in. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way, Elena. I really am." Veronica's voice dripped with false sympathy. "But he was never going to tell you himself. Men like Marcus, they need a push." Elena's body reacted before her mind could catch up. Her heart began to pound, slamming against her ribs with a force that stole her breath. Her vision narrowed until all she could see was Veronica's face. That smile, that belly, that hand resting possessively on the curve that should have meant nothing but instead meant everything. A sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. Low, deep, wrong. She gasped and looked down. Blood, bright red, spreading across the white fabric of her maternity dress like a flower blooming in fast forward. The scream that tore from her throat was not words. It was something primal, animal. The sound of a mother who knows with absolute certainty that something is terribly, catastrophically wrong. Her legs gave out beneath her. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Marcus, still standing frozen, still saying nothing, still doing nothing while his wife collapsed in a pool of her own blood on the floor of their penthouse. And behind him, already turning toward the door, Veronica Shaw walked away without looking back. The ambulance ride passed in fragments. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, aware of voices shouting medical terminology she didn't understand, of hands pressing against her body, of pain that came in waves so intense they seemed to exist outside of time itself. Rachel was there. That much she knew. Her best friend's face kept appearing above her, tear-streaked and terrified, saying things Elena couldn't quite hear over the roaring in her ears. "Stay with me, Elena, stay with me. We're almost there, just hold on." She wanted to hold on. She wanted to fight, but her body felt like it belonged to someone else, a traitor that had turned against her at the moment she needed it most. Every breath was a struggle. Every heartbeat felt like it might be her last. And beneath the pain, beneath the fear, one thought kept circling through her mind like a vulture waiting for something to die. "Save her. Please. Whatever happens to me, save my baby." The emergency room was chaos. Elena was rushed through double doors into a world of harsh fluorescent lights and the smell of antiseptic that would haunt her dreams for years to come. Doctors and nurses swarmed around her, their faces hidden behind masks, their eyes communicating urgency in a language that needed no words. Someone said placental abruption, and Elena knew enough to understand that those two words meant her daughter was dying. The placenta had separated from her uterine wall. The stress, the shock, the trauma of what she had just witnessed had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction inside her body. Her blood was flooding places it was never meant to go, and her baby, her Grace, was suffocating in the darkness of the womb that should have protected her. They rushed her into surgery. Elena was conscious for longer than she should have been, fighting the sedation with everything she had because she needed to know, needed to hear them say the words that would tell her everything was going to be okay. The words never came. Instead, she heard monitors beeping with increasing urgency. She heard voices calling out numbers that dropped with terrifying speed. Fetal heartbeat at 60. We need to deliver now. 50, 40. She's losing too much blood. Elena screamed, the sound tearing from her throat raw and desperate. Save her. Please, save my baby. Heartbeat at 20. We're losing her. 10. Silence, then the sound that would echo in Elena's nightmares for the rest of her life. The long, continuous tone of a heart that had stopped beating. She didn't remember anything after that. The sedation finally claimed her, pulling her down into a darkness that felt like mercy. When she woke, the world had changed. The hospital room was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes you afraid to breathe because any sound you make will shatter something fragile. Elena knew before anyone told her. The emptiness inside her body was absolute. A void where warmth and movement in life had lived just hours before. The weight that had been her constant companion for 9 months, the presence that had kicked and hiccuped and pressed tiny feet against her ribs, was gone. A nurse appeared at her bedside. Her eyes were red, her expression carefully composed in the way of medical professionals who have delivered this kind of news before and know there is no gentle way to do it. Mrs. Carter, the nurse's voice was soft. Would you like to hold your daughter? Elena nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. They brought Grace to her. She was wrapped in a pink blanket, the same shade of pink that had decorated the baby shower that now seemed like it had happened in another lifetime. Her face was perfect. Her tiny fingers were perfect. Her closed eyes, her button nose, the soft curve of her cheeks, everything was exactly as Elena had imagined during all those months of waiting and hoping and dreaming. But she was cold. Elena held her daughter for 47 minutes. She counted every one, marking time and heartbeats that only she could feel, because Grace's heart would never beat again. She whispered things she would never repeat to anyone else, apologies that caught in her throat, promises she could no longer keep, love that had nowhere to accept into the empty air of a hospital room that smelled like death and disinfectant. I'm sorry, she said over and over, the words becoming a prayer, a curse, a lullaby for a child who would never need one. I'm so sorry, baby girl. Mommy tried. Mommy tried so hard to protect you. I'm sorry I couldn't. I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. Rachel came in at some point. Elena didn't know when. Time had stopped making sense, collapsing in on itself like a building whose foundation had crumbled. Her best friend sat beside her, took her hand, and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some losses are too vast for words, too deep for comfort, too absolute for anything except shared silence. Finally, Elena spoke. Her voice was hollow, scraped raw by screaming, emptied of everything except the question she had to ask, even though she already knew the answer. Where is Marcus? Rachel's face tightened. She didn't want to answer. That reluctance told Elena everything she needed to know, but she asked anyway because she needed to hear it confirmed, needed to transform suspicion into certainty so she could begin the process of hating the man she had loved. Rachel, where is my husband? Rachel's hand trembled as she reached for her phone. She pulled up Instagram, navigated to a profile, and turned the screen toward Elena. Veronica Shaw's story, posted 2 hours ago. A photo of a candlelit dinner table at an expensive restaurant, crystal glasses, white tablecloths, and there, visible in the background but unmistakable, Marcus Carter raising a glass of wine to his lips. The caption read, "He chose us," followed by a heart emoji. While Elena was losing their daughter, while doctors were fighting to save a life that couldn't be saved, while a tiny heart was stopping forever, Marcus had been having dinner with his mistress. He chose us. Elena stared at the screen for a long moment. Something inside her shifted, changed, hardened into something unrecognizable. The grief was still there, vast and overwhelming, but now it had company, a cold, clear rage that burned through the fog of her pain like a searchlight cutting through darkness. Get out, she said. Elena, everyone, get out. I need to be alone with my daughter. Rachel hesitated, tears streaming down her face, but something in Elena's expression made her nod and rise from her chair. She paused at the door, looking back at her best friend cradling the body of a child who would never grow up. I'm so sorry, she whispered. The door closed behind her. Elena looked down at Grace's perfect, peaceful face, the face that would never smile, never cry, never look up at her mother with recognition and love. I promise you, baby girl, she said, her voice low and steady, and filled with a fury that surprised even her. I promise they will pay for what they did to us. Every single one of them. The funeral was held 5 days later. It was a small ceremony at a cemetery outside the city. Gray sky, light rain that seemed to fall more out of obligation than genuine grief, as if the weather itself knew that nothing could match the sorrow of what was being buried in that too small grave. Elena's parents were there, her sister, Rachel standing at a careful distance, uncertain of her welcome. A handful of friends who had known Elena before Marcus, before the money, before everything had gone so terribly wrong. The Carter family was notably absent. No Marcus, no Donald Carter Sr., the patriarch who had built a real estate empire on bribes and intimidation and had passed those lessons down to his son. No flowers, no cards, no acknowledgement whatsoever that the child being lowered into the ground had been their blood too. Elena stood at the graveside in black, her body still healing from surgery that had saved her life at the cost of everything she cared about. She watched the tiny coffin descend into the earth and felt something descend with it, some capacity for softness, some ability to forgive. The priest spoke words she didn't hear, prayers she didn't feel, platitudes that meant nothing in the face of loss so absolute it seemed to swallow the entire world. After the service, after the other mourners had drifted away with their murmured condolences and their uncertain hugs, Rachel approached her. Elena, her voice was tentative, afraid. There's something you need to know. Something I should have told you before. Elena turned to look at her. Really look for the first time since the hospital. Rachel's face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her expression twisted with guilt that had been eating at her for months. I've seen things at the office. Marcus and Veronica. I suspected for months. I didn't say anything because I didn't have proof and I didn't want to upset you during the pregnancy. And you knew. The words hung in the air between them, heavy as stones. I suspected. I didn't know for certain until you suspected my husband was cheating on me, and you said nothing. Rachel's tears started falling again. I was trying to protect you. I thought maybe I was wrong. I thought, get away from me. Elena, please. You were my best friend. Elena's voice cracked on the word. You watched me plan a nursery for a baby you knew might not have a father. You watched me believe in a man you knew was lying to me. You sat in that room while Veronica Shaw walked through the door, and you said nothing. Nothing. Not even a warning. Rachel reached for her. Elena stepped back as if her touch were poison. Don't touch me. Don't ever touch me again. She turned and walked away, leaving Rachel standing alone among the gravestones, crying in the rain. Elena had lost her daughter. She had lost her husband, and now she had lost her best friend. She was completely, utterly alone. But as she walked toward the cemetery gates, her spine straightened and her chin lifted. The grief was still there, a weight she would carry forever. But beneath it, something else was growing. Something sharp and cold and patient. They had taken everything from her. Now she had nothing left to lose. 1 week after the funeral, Elena was served with divorce papers. She was sitting in her childhood bedroom at her parents' house, surrounded by stuffed animals and faded posters from her teenage years, when the doorbell rang. Her mother answered it, and Elena heard raised voices, then footsteps approaching her door. The process server was a young man in a cheap suit who couldn't meet her eyes as he thrust the envelope into her hands. You've been served, Mrs. Carter. He fled before she could respond, as if he sensed the devastation he was delivering and wanted no part of the aftermath. Elena opened the envelope with steady hands. She had expected this, known it was coming since the moment she saw that Instagram post from the hospital bed where she had just lost her daughter. But somehow, seeing it in black and white, printed on expensive legal paper with Marcus's name at the bottom, still felt like a physical blow. Not from Marcus, from Marcus. He had filed first. The papers cited irreconcilable differences and referenced the prenuptial agreement she had signed 7 years ago. Elena remembered that day clearly. Marcus had been apologetic, almost embarrassed, explaining that his lawyers insisted on it even though he would never need it, even though they would be together forever. She had signed without reading every line, without hiring her own lawyer, without doing any of the things a sensible woman would have done, because she had trusted him completely and couldn't imagine a future where that trust would be betrayed. Now she read every word with the careful attention of someone searching a minefield for hidden explosives. What she found made her stomach turn. In case of divorce, Elena would receive a one-time payment of $50,000. All assets acquired during the marriage would remain with the primary earner, meaning Marcus. All property in his name would stay in his name. The penthouse, the cars, the vacation homes, the investment accounts, all of it belonged to him. She had been married to a man worth $200 million for 7 years, and she would walk away with $50,000. It wasn't enough to buy a modest house. It wasn't enough to start over with any real security. It was severance pay, the kind of token settlement a company offers a fired employee so they won't make a fuss on their way out the door. Elena spent the next 3 days calling lawyers. The first attorney she contacted, a partner at a prestigious firm she had found through a Google search, listened politely to her story, and then told her they couldn't take her case due to a conflict of interest. The Carter family, it seemed, had retained their services years ago for some unspecified matter that prevented them from representing anyone adverse to Carter interests. The second lawyer said the same thing. Different firm, same excuse. The third was more blunt about it. Look, Mrs. Carter, I'm going to level with you. The Carters have connections with half the legal establishment in this city. Even if I wanted to take your case, and frankly I don't because I like my career right where it is, I'd be setting myself up for professional suicide. Find someone who doesn't have anything to lose. Or better yet, take the 50,000 and move somewhere far away. Start fresh. Forget you ever knew these people. Elena hung up without responding. The fourth lawyer she called was different. Jennifer Walsh operated out of a small office above a dry cleaner in Queens. Her furniture was secondhand, her receptionist was a part-time law student, and her client list consisted primarily of domestic violence survivors and women fighting for custody against wealthy ex-husbands. She was exactly what Elena needed. Jennifer reviewed the prenuptial agreement for 3 hours, making notes, circling clauses, occasionally muttering under her breath. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim but honest. Mrs. Carter, I have to be straight with you. This prenup is airtight. Whoever drafted it knew exactly what they were doing. You have almost no legal recourse for the assets. What about the affair? What about the fact that his mistress caused the death of my baby? Jennifer sighed. You can file a civil suit for intentional infliction of emotional distress. But proving causation, proving that the shock of Veronica Shaw's announcement directly caused the placental abruption, that's extremely difficult. The defense will argue that abruptions happen spontaneously, that there were underlying medical factors, that you can't draw a straight line from emotional trauma to physical consequence. But it did happen. She walked into my baby shower and announced she was pregnant with my husband's child. The stress caused my placenta to separate from my uterine wall. My daughter died. I believe you. Any reasonable person would believe you. But belief isn't proof, and proof is what wins cases. The Carter family has resources to fight this for years, decades. They can hire expert witnesses who will testify that your condition was pre-existing. They can bury you in paperwork, in depositions, and motions until you run out of money and give up. Jennifer leaned forward, her eyes filled with sympathy and frustration in equal measure. I'm sorry, my honest advice, take the $50,000. Start over. Move somewhere they can't reach you and try to heal. Elena sat in silence for a long moment. The grief was still there, always there, a constant weight pressing down on her chest. But something else was rising to meet it. Something that refused to accept this outcome. Something that whispered in a voice that sounded like her daughter's imagined cries, that justice wasn't just about money or legal victories. Justice was about making them pay. She stood. No, Jennifer blinked. Mrs. Carter, I'm not taking $50,000 and walking away. My daughter is dead because of them. I will not let them pay me to disappear. Then what will you do? Elena didn't have an answer, not yet, but she would find one. She left Jennifer Walsh's office with a promise to stay in touch and stepped out into the gray afternoon light of Queens. The city stretched around her in all directions, a maze of concrete and steel filled with people living their ordinary lives, unaware of the battle she was about to begin. She had no money, no lawyer willing to fight for her, no allies who could stand against the Carter family's power and influence, no clear path forward. But she had the one thing Marcus hadn't planned for. She had nothing left to lose. And that, she was beginning to understand, was a kind of freedom. That night, Elena couldn't sleep. She lay in her childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through memories of her marriage like a detective reviewing evidence at a crime scene. Every conversation with Marcus, every business trip he had taken, every late night he had claimed to be working, every small lie she had overlooked because she wanted to believe in the life they were building together. The signs had been there. She could see that now. The way his phone always faced down on the table. The passwords he changed every few months for security reasons. The distance that had crept into their intimacy, so gradual she hadn't noticed until it was too late. How many women had there been before Veronica? How many had come after? How many more would there be if she walked away with her $50,000 and let them continue? At 3 in the morning, Elena opened her laptop and began to search. Marcus Carter, Carter Technologies, Donald Carter Sr., Veronica Shaw. The results were a mix of press releases and puff pieces, the kind of carefully managed public image that wealthy people paid fortunes to maintain. Marcus was a visionary entrepreneur. Donald Sr. was a philanthropist who donated generously to hospitals and universities. The company was revolutionizing whatever industry it happened to be targeting that quarter. But beneath the surface, buried under pages of positive coverage, Elena found something else, a cached fragment of an article that had never been published, a ghost story preserved only because the internet never truly forgets. The headline read, Carter Technologies accused of financial fraud, hostile workplace culture, and silenced accusers. The byline was Victoria Wells, investigative journalist. Elena read every word twice. The article alleged that Donald Carter Sr. had built his real estate empire on bribes paid to local politicians and inspectors who looked the other way, while his buildings went up in violation of safety codes. It claimed that Marcus had learned these tactics and applied them to his tech company, using shell corporations to hide money, NDAs to silence employees who complained, and legal intimidation to crush anyone who threatened to expose the truth. The story was explosive, the kind of journalism that wins awards and destroys dynasties. But it had never been published. Elena searched for Victoria Wells. She found her easily enough. Still a journalist, but now freelance, writing for small outlets and independent publications that paid pennies compared to the major newspapers where she had once worked. Her career had clearly taken a devastating turn at some point, though the articles about her were vague on the details. Elena composed an email, typing and deleting and retyping until the words felt right. Ms. Wells, my name is Elena Mitchell. I was married to Marcus Carter. My daughter is dead because of him. I believe you have information that could help me. Please contact me. She hit send before she could talk herself out of it. Then she lay back down and stared at the ceiling, waiting for dawn, waiting for an answer, waiting for something to change. 3 days later, her phone rang. The diner was the kind of place that time had forgotten. Cracked vinyl booths patched with duct tape, a counter lined with stools whose cushions had seen better decades, coffee that came in ceramic mugs stained by years of use and served by a waitress who called everyone Han without a trace of irony. Elena arrived first and chose a booth in the back corner, facing the door. She wasn't sure why she felt the need for a clear line of sight, only that something had shifted inside her over the past week. A vigilance that hadn't been there before, an awareness that she was now playing a game whose rules she didn't fully understand, against opponents who had been playing much longer than she had. Victoria Wells walked in at exactly 2 o'clock. She was older than Elena had expected, perhaps 50, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and sharp eyes that seemed to catalog everything in the room within seconds of entering. She wore jeans and a worn leather jacket, the uniform of someone who had long ago stopped caring about appearances and focused instead on substance. She spotted Elena immediately and crossed the diner with purposeful strides. Mrs. Mitchell? It wasn't a question. Ms. Wells, thank you for meeting me. Victoria slid into the booth across from her and signaled the waitress for coffee. She didn't speak again until the mug was in front of her and the waitress had moved away. I've been investigating the Carter family for 6 years. Her voice was low, pitched to carry no further than their table. The father, Donald Sr., built his real estate empire on bribes, intimidation, and fraud. Marcus learned everything from him. The company, the money, the power. None of it is clean. Then why hasn't anyone exposed them? Victoria's expression hardened. Because I tried. 4 years ago, I had sources, documents, everything I needed to bring them down. 2 weeks before publication, my editor killed the story. The official reason was insufficient corroboration. The real reason was a phone call from Donald Carter Sr. to the paper's owner. That's corruption. That's power. When you have enough of it, the rules don't apply to you anymore. The Carters have been operating above the law for decades. They've bought politicians, judges, journalists, anyone who might threaten their empire. The few people brave enough to stand against them have been systematically destroyed. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the diner's struggling air conditioning. What happened to your sources? Victoria's hand tightened around her coffee mug. One was paid off, enough money to change his mind and his story. One was threatened into silence. Her husband received photos of their children at school, with notes suggesting that terrible accidents can happen to kids who play unsupervised. She paused, and when she continued, her voice had dropped even lower. And one was my daughter, Sarah. She worked at Carter Technologies in their early days, before Marcus became the golden boy of the tech industry. She was the one who first brought me the documents. The real documents, not the sanitized versions they released to the public. What happened to her? The pause stretched long enough that Elena began to wonder if Victoria would answer at all. They destroyed her, professionally, financially, socially. They planted stories about her being mentally unstable, a disgruntled employee with a vendetta. They leaked false information to every employer she'd applied to. They called her landlords with anonymous tips about drug use and criminal activity. Within 6 months, she couldn't get a job, couldn't rent an apartment, couldn't walk into a grocery store without people whispering behind her back. Victoria's eyes met Elena's, and the pain in them was bottomless. She was 26 years old, and they erased her from the world, made her feel like she didn't exist anymore, like she had never existed. Where is she now? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had long since burned out. She took her own life. 3 years ago, she was 28. Elena reached across the table and took Victoria's hand. The gesture was instinctive, one grieving mother to another, though Victoria's loss was different in shape, if not in depth. I'm so sorry. I don't want sorry. Victoria's voice was steady now, hardened by years of carrying rage alongside grief. I want justice. I've been waiting for someone with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. Someone the Carters have hurt badly enough that they won't back down, no matter what. She looked at Elena with an intensity that felt like being examined under a microscope. I think that someone is you. Elena didn't look away. What do you need from me? Access, information, the willingness to go on record when the time comes, and most importantly, patience. We can't strike until we're ready. If we move too soon, they'll crush us like they crushed everyone else. How long? 6 months, maybe more. We need to build a case so airtight they can't wriggle out of it. We need multiple sources, independent verification, witnesses who are willing to testify. One woman's word against a billionaire family isn't enough. But 3 women? 4? A pattern of behavior documented over years? That's different. That's a story even their money can't kill. Elena thought about Grace, about the promise she had made at the grave, whispering into the cold earth that held her daughter's body. I can wait as long as it takes. Victoria nodded slowly, something like respect flickering in her eyes. Good, then let's begin. Over the next 2 hours, Victoria laid out everything she knew about the Carter family's operations. The shell companies used to hide money. The lawyers who specialized in making problems disappear. The network of influence that stretched through politics, media, and law enforcement. It was worse than Elena had imagined. Much worse. The Carters weren't just corrupt. They were systematic about it. They had built an infrastructure of protection that had operated for decades, passing techniques and connections from father to son like a family business. Because that's exactly what it was. Marcus wasn't just a cheating husband. He was the heir to a criminal enterprise disguised as legitimate business. And Veronica Shaw wasn't just a mistress. She was an operative, a fixer who identified targets, managed relationships, and cleaned up messes when things got complicated. Elena thought about all the women Marcus might have hurt before her, all the women he would hurt after her if no one stopped him. We'll need help, she said finally, more than just the 2 of us. I have contacts, journalists who still believe in the truth, even if they have to publish it in places the mainstream media won't touch. Lawyers who've been waiting for a chance to take on clients like this. But the key is finding others who've been hurt by the Carters. Other women. The more voices we have, the harder we are to silence. How do we find them? Victoria's smile was grim. We start looking. And when we find them, we convince them that the risk is worth it. That this time things might actually be different. Elena nodded. The weight of what they were attempting settled over her like a shroud, heavy and dark and suffocating. But somewhere beneath that weight, something else stirred. A spark of hope she hadn't felt since before the baby shower, before the blood, before the silence of a heart that would never beat again. Maybe things could be different. Maybe justice was still possible. Maybe Grace's death wouldn't be in vain. She pushed those thoughts aside as she and Victoria exchanged contact information and agreed on secure methods of communication. Hope was dangerous. It could make you careless, make you take risks you shouldn't take. But as she drove back to her parents' house through the gathering dusk, Elena found herself thinking about the future for the first time since she had held her daughter's cold body in her arms. It wouldn't be the future she had planned. That future was dead, buried in a small grave outside the city. But maybe she could build a new one. A future where the Carters paid for what they had done. A future where other women didn't have to suffer what she had suffered. A future that meant something. 2 months later, Rachel Torres appeared on her parents' doorstep. Elena almost didn't answer the door. She had spent the weeks since the funeral avoiding anyone who might try to comfort her, might try to pull her back into the ordinary world of grocery shopping and small talk, when all she wanted was to focus on the mission Victoria had given her. But something made her open the door anyway. Maybe curiosity, maybe exhaustion, maybe some stubborn thread of connection that couldn't be severed no matter how badly she wanted to cut it. Rachel looked terrible. She had lost weight, her clothes hanging loose on her frame. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her hair unwashed, her whole demeanor radiating the kind of misery that comes from guilt that has been eating at you for too long. "I know you hate me," she said before Elena could speak. "I know I failed you, but I have something that might help." She held out a USB drive. Elena stared at it without taking it. "What is this?" "I was fired from Carter Technologies. The official reason was restructuring. The real reason is that someone found out I was your friend, and Marcus decided I was a liability." "When?" "3 weeks ago. They escorted me out of the building with security guards watching like I was a criminal. Didn't even let me say goodbye to my coworkers." Something shifted in Elena's expression. Not forgiveness, that was still too far away to reach, but recognition, perhaps. Understanding that Rachel had paid a price for their friendship, even if it wasn't enough to balance the scales. "Before they took my access away, I copied everything I could," Rachel continued. "Emails, financial records, HR complaints that were buried, and something else." "What?" "There was another woman. Before Veronica. Her name was Megan Holloway. She worked in marketing. She got pregnant." Rachel's voice dropped. "Marcus paid her off. $200,000 and an NDA. I found her contact information." Elena took the USB drive. "Rachel, why are you doing this?" The tears that had been threatening finally spilled over. "Because you were right. I should have told you. I should have protected you. I didn't. And your daughter died because I was a coward." Her voice broke on the last word. "I can't change that. I can never change that. But I can help you now if you'll let me." Elena stood in silence for a long moment, the USB drive pressing against her palm like a promise or a threat. This was the woman who had betrayed her trust, who had known and said nothing, who had let her walk blindly into destruction because she was afraid of what speaking up might cost her. But this was also the woman who had just lost her job to bring her this information, who had risked everything to gather evidence that might make a difference. And Elena needed help. Victoria had been clear about that. One woman's word against a billionaire family wasn't enough. They needed voices. They needed witnesses. They needed anyone brave enough to stand with them. "One chance," she said finally. "You get one chance. If you ever lie to me again, if you ever hide anything from me again, we're done. Forever." "I understand." "Find Megan Holloway. Get her to talk. Find out what she knows and whether she's willing to testify when the time comes." Rachel nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I won't let you down. Not this time." Elena wanted to believe her, but belief had gotten her into this mess in the first place. Trust would have to wait. For now, all she had was a USB drive full of stolen documents, an ally whose loyalty was still in question, and a list of names that might lead her to other women who had been hurt by the same monster who had destroyed her life. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The coffee shop was deliberately ordinary. Elena had chosen it for that reason. Nothing memorable about the location, the decor, the slightly burnt smell of over-roasted beans that hung in the air. A place where two women having a conversation wouldn't attract a second glance. Megan Holloway arrived 7 minutes late, checking over her shoulder as she entered. She was 31, pretty in a worn-down way, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she hadn't slept well in years. She spotted Elena and hesitated, clearly second-guessing her decision to come. Elena raised her hand in a small wave. Non-threatening, patient. After a long moment, Megan crossed the coffee shop and slid into the seat across from her. "I shouldn't be here," she said immediately. "I signed an NDA. If they find out I'm talking to you, they'll destroy what's left of my life." "I understand, and I appreciate you coming anyway. Rachel said you lost a baby because of Marcus." The words hit Elena like they always did, a fresh wound that would never fully heal. "Yes, she was 9 months along. Her name was Grace." Megan's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I know what it's like to lose a child because of him." Elena leaned forward. "Tell me." The story came out in fragments, broken and reassembled over 2 hours and 3 cups of coffee that neither woman drank. Megan had been 25 when she started at Carter Technologies. Fresh out of business school, eager to prove himself, flattered by the attention of the handsome CEO who seemed to see something special in her. "He has a way of making you feel like you're the only person in the room," Megan said. "Like everything you say is fascinating. Like you're different from all the other women, special in a way they can't understand." "I know," Elena said quietly. "We were together for 6 months. I thought he was going to leave his wife for me." A bitter laugh. "His wife at the time, I mean. Before you. There was someone else before you too." "I didn't know." "Nobody knows, that's the point. He cycles through women, and when things get complicated, Veronica makes them go away." "Veronica?" "She's not his girlfriend. Not really. She's his fixer. She identifies targets, manages the relationships, handles the cleanup when it's time to move on. She's been doing it for years. I think she believes she's special too, that she's the one he really loves and the rest of us are just distractions. But she's as much a victim as any of us, even if she doesn't know it." Elena filed that information away for later. "What happened when you got pregnant?" Megan's face crumpled. "I was so happy at first. So stupid. I thought this would be the thing that made him choose me. Instead, it was the thing that made me disposable." "He paid you off. $200,000 and an NDA. Veronica delivered the check personally. She told me I had a choice. Take the money and disappear, or fight and lose everything. My career, my reputation, my future. She said they would make here I never worked in any industry they had connections to, and their connections are everywhere." "So you took the money." "What else could I do? I was alone, pregnant, terrified. I didn't have family who could help, friends who understood what I was going through. I took their money and I signed their paper, and I promised to never speak about what happened." "And the baby?" A long silence. "I gave her up for adoption. A closed adoption, arranged through lawyers the Carters recommended. I never even saw her face." The tears were flowing freely now. "I think about her every day. I wonder who she became, whether she's happy, whether she knows there's a mother out there who loved her but wasn't strong enough to fight for her." Elena reached across the table and took Megan's hand. "You were strong enough to survive. That counts for something." "Does it?" "Because most days it doesn't feel like survival. It feels like existing. Going through the motions of a life while the real me died in that lawyer's office when I signed away my rights to my own daughter." They sat in silence for a long moment, two women bound by grief and the man who had caused it. Finally, Elena spoke. "Will you testify when the time comes?" Megan pulled her hand back. "You don't understand. The NDA..." "I know about the NDA, but NDAs can be challenged, especially when they're used to cover up criminal behavior. And if we have enough witnesses, enough evidence, enough voices speaking together, they won't be able to silence all of us. They destroyed my life once already." They'll do it again. What if you weren't alone this time? What if there were 4 of us, 5 of us, standing together? What if we made sure the whole world was watching so they couldn't make us disappear like they did before? Megan shook her head, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. A spark of something that might be hope, or might just be the desire to believe that hope was still possible. Find the others. The women Marcus hurt before me, before you. Get them to agree. Show me I won't be standing alone. And if I do, another long pause. Then I'll think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. Elena would take what she could get. Over the next 3 months, Elena, Victoria, and Rachel worked in careful coordination. Victoria used her journalist contacts to dig into the Carter family's financial records, finding inconsistencies that pointed to fraud and embezzlement. Rachel reached out to former Carter Technologies employees who had left under suspicious circumstances, listening to their stories, identifying patterns that might lead to other victims. And Elena searched for the women. It was slow, painstaking work. The Carters had been thorough in covering their tracks. NDAs and payoffs had silenced most of the victims, and those who hadn't been bought off had been intimidated into keeping quiet. But gradually names emerged from the shadows. Jennifer Lawson. She had worked as Marcus's assistant before Veronica, had been discarded when she became inconvenient, had rebuilt her life in a small town in Oregon where no one knew her history. Catherine Brooks. She had been an intern at Carter Technologies, barely 20 years old when Marcus seduced her, had attempted suicide when Veronica delivered the payoff check and the demand that she disappear. Others. 3 more women scattered across the country, each carrying the same story in different variations. Each had believed she was special. Each had been systematically destroyed when she became a liability. Elena contacted them one by one, listened to their stories, shared her own, asked if they would be willing to stand together when the time came. Most said no at first. The fear was too deep, the memories too painful, the risk too great. But Elena was patient. She understood something that the Carters didn't, something that victims of powerful abusers often discover too late. Shame loses its power when you share it. The isolation that made each of them vulnerable, the belief that they were alone, that no one would believe them, that speaking up would only bring more pain, that isolation was the Carters' greatest weapon. And it could be defeated, not by fighting alone, by standing together. 4 months into the investigation, Elena believed they were finally ready. They had assembled everything: financial documents proving fraud, testimony from 5 women describing the same pattern of seduction, manipulation, and destruction, evidence of bribery and witness intimidation that connected Marcus to his father's criminal enterprise. Victoria had contacts at 3 independent media outlets willing to publish simultaneously, ensuring the story couldn't be killed by a single phone call to a single editor. Rachel had assembled a timeline of Marcus's predatory behavior spanning 15 years, documenting each victim, each payoff, each ruined life. It was enough, more than enough. The kind of evidence that would destroy the Carter empire and send both Marcus and his father to prison. And then everything fell apart. The first blow came on a Tuesday morning. Elena's father called her into the living room, his face pale, his hands trembling, as he held a piece of paper he had clearly read multiple times already. "They're calling in our mortgage," he said. Elena took the letter and read it with growing horror. The bank was demanding immediate payment of the full remaining balance on her parents' home loan. $380,000 due within 30 days, or the house would be foreclosed upon. "That's not how mortgages work," Elena said. "They can't just..." But even as she spoke, she remembered what Victoria had told her about Donald Carter Sr.'s business interests: real estate, banking, an interconnected web of companies that controlled vast swaths of the American economy. The bank that held her parents' mortgage was a subsidiary of a holding company that was owned by a trust that was ultimately controlled by the Carter family. They had found her pressure point. "Mom has lived in this house for 35 years, her father said. His voice was steady, but Elena could see the fear beneath it. Her mother's health had been fragile since a heart attack 2 years earlier. The stress of losing their home might literally kill her. "I'll figure something out," Elena said, not believing her own words. The second blow came 3 days later. Victoria called late at night, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Two men came to see me today. They didn't threaten me directly. They just mentioned my granddaughter, where she goes to school, what time she gets picked up, how pretty she is. Elena felt ice forming in her chest. Victoria, I can't do this anymore. I can't risk her. She's all I have left of Sarah, the only piece of my daughter that's still in this world. If something happened to her because of me, her voice broke. I'm sorry, Elena. I'm so sorry. I know what this means. I know I'm letting you down, letting Sarah down, letting everyone down. But I can't. I just can't. The line went dead. Elena sat in the darkness of her childhood bedroom, staring at her phone, feeling the walls closing in. Victoria was her connection to the press, her most experienced ally, the architect of the entire plan. Without her, everything they had built was compromised. The third blow was the most public. A tabloid, one of those papers that trafficked in celebrity gossip and manufactured scandal, published a story with the headline, "Grieving Ex-Wife Wages Harassment Campaign Against Tech CEO." The article painted Elena as mentally unstable, obsessed, dangerous. It quoted psychiatric experts who had never examined her, describing symptoms of delusional thinking and pathological jealousy. It published private medical records, her history of anxiety medication, her therapy sessions after Grace's death that could only have been obtained illegally. It called her a woman scorned, a cautionary tale about what happens when someone refuses to accept that their marriage is over. The story went viral within hours. Elena watched in horror as her name trended on social media, not as a victim seeking justice, but as a crazy ex-wife who couldn't let go. Comment sections filled with mockery and contempt. Former acquaintances came out of the woodwork to provide anonymous quotes about how they always knew she was unstable. Her phone began buzzing with death threats from strangers who had appointed themselves Marcus Carter's defenders. In the span of 1 week, Elena had lost her parents' home security, her most important ally, and her reputation. She was utterly, completely alone. That night, she sat on the floor of her childhood bedroom, holding the only photo she had of Grace. A hospital photo taken during those 47 minutes when she had held her daughter's body, when hope was already dead, but love hadn't yet learned to let go. Grace's face was peaceful in the picture. Perfect. As if she were only sleeping and might wake at any moment, reach up with those tiny fingers and finally be held by a mother who would never stop mourning her. Elena had lost everything. Her daughter, her marriage, her money, her reputation, her allies, her parents' home. There was nothing left to take. And maybe she thought that was exactly what they wanted. To strip her down to nothing until she gave up, signed whatever they wanted her to sign, and disappeared into the silence that had swallowed all the women who came before her. Her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. What was the point? Another reporter looking for a comment on her mental breakdown? Another stranger calling to tell her she deserved what happened to her daughter? But something made her pick up anyway. Stubbornness, maybe. Or the last flicker of the fighter she had been before everything went wrong. Mrs. Mitchell? The voice was familiar. Megan Holloway. I saw the article. I saw what they did to you. Then you know why you shouldn't be calling me. They'll find out. They'll destroy you too. Let them try. There was steel in Megan's voice that hadn't been there before. I've made a decision. I'm done hiding. I'm done being afraid. They destroyed my life once, and I've spent 3 years pretending it didn't happen. But it did. And if I stay silent, they'll keep doing it to other women. Elena's heart began to pound. What are you saying? I'm breaking my NDA. I'm going public, tomorrow, with or without you. Megan, you'll lose everything. I already lost everything. The day I signed that paper and promised to stay quiet about my own child, I lost everything that mattered. I've been a ghost for 3 years. I'm ready to be real again. Elena felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't have said when they started. The other women, Megan continued, Jennifer and Catherine and the others. I've been talking to them, showing them the article about you, showing them what happens when you try to fight alone. They're going to help. They're going to stand with us, all of them. They said if you're still fighting after everything the Carters have done to you, They can't hide anymore either. Elena pressed her free hand against her chest, trying to contain the hope that was threatening to explode. Victoria backed out. She was our connection to the press. Without her, then find another way. You're Elena Mitchell. You lost your daughter and you're still fighting. You're the strongest person I've ever met. Figure it out. The call ended. Elena sat in the darkness, Grace's photo still clutched in her other hand, tears still falling, mind racing through possibilities she had thought were closed to her. If the mainstream press wouldn't help, she would go around them. The Carters controlled newspapers and TV networks and all the traditional channels of information. But they couldn't control the internet. She opened her laptop and began to write. The website went live at midnight, gracecartertruth.com, named after her daughter, dedicated to her memory, built on the bones of everything Elena had lost. She uploaded everything they had gathered, her story in her own words. The financial documents proving fraud and embezzlement, video testimonies from Megan and the other women, faces exposed, voices clear, NDAs be damned. A timeline spanning 15 years. Names, dates, payoffs, destroyed lives. The pattern laid bare for anyone willing to look. She contacted every podcaster, YouTuber, and independent journalist she could find. The ones the Carters hadn't bought. The ones who had built their audiences by exposing exactly this kind of story. Most didn't respond. A few declined politely, not wanting to tangle with people who had that kind of money and that kind of lawyers. But one said yes. Derek Morrison ran a podcast called Truth Unfiltered. He had built his reputation on investigations that mainstream media wouldn't touch, and his audience numbered in the millions. He had been waiting for a story like this his entire career. This is explosive, he told Elena during their first call. If even half of this is true, it's the biggest corporate scandal of the decade. But I need one thing before I run it. What? Verification. Someone inside the company who can confirm the documents are real. Otherwise, they'll claim you fabricated everything and my credibility goes up in smoke. Elena didn't have anyone inside. Victoria was gone. Rachel had been fired months ago. The other women had all been separated from the company for years. Then her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I know who you are. I know what you're trying to do. I can help. Meet me tomorrow. Come alone. The parking garage was nearly empty at noon on a Wednesday. Elena walked through the concrete maze with her heart pounding and her keys clutched between her fingers like a weapon. This could be a trap. The Carters could have found out about the website and decided to deal with her more directly than lawsuits and tabloid articles. But she had come too far to stop now. A woman stepped out from behind a pillar, mid-40s, expensive suit, exhausted eyes. My name is Patricia Vance. I'm the CFO of Carter Technologies. I've worked for Marcus for 8 years. Elena stopped walking. Why would the CFO help me? Because 3 months ago, Marcus passed me over for a promotion. Gave it to Veronica instead, a woman with no financial experience, no qualifications, nothing except the fact that she's carrying his child. Patricia's voice was bitter. I built this company's financial infrastructure. I made him rich, and he threw me away like I was nothing. So this is revenge? No, this is justice. Patricia's expression softened slightly. I've seen what he does to women. I've processed the payoffs. I've buried the complaints. I've looked the other way for 8 years because I thought I was protecting my career. But I was just protecting him. She held out a flash drive. This is everything, every payment, every shell company, every bribe, every dollar Marcus and his father have stolen or hidden. It's enough to put them both in prison and for 20 years. Elena stared at the drive, afraid to touch it, afraid not to. Why should I trust you? You shouldn't, but you don't have a choice, and neither do I. Patricia pushed the drive into Elena's hand. When this goes public, my career is over either way. I'd rather be known as the woman who finally told the truth than the woman who helped them cover it up. Elena's fingers closed around the drive. Thank you. Don't thank me. Just make sure they pay. The day before the story was scheduled to go live, Marcus's lawyers called. Mr. Carter would have liked to meet with you, the attorney said, privately, to discuss a settlement. I'm not interested in a settlement. Mr. Carter is prepared to offer you $5 million in exchange for dropping all claims and signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement. $5 million, enough to save her parents' house, enough to rebuild her life, enough to disappear into comfort and safety and let the world forget it Elena Mitchell ever existed. She thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. Tell Mr. Carter I'll meet with him tonight. The restaurant was the kind of place where a glass of wine cost more than Elena had earned in a week of teaching kindergarten. Marcus was already seated when she arrived, looking older than she remembered, thinner. The confidence was still there, but there was something underneath it now. Hairline cracks in the foundation of a man who had spent his entire life believing he was untouchable. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw surprise in his eyes, as if he hadn't expected her to actually show up. Elena, you look well. I look like a woman whose daughter is dead because of you. He flinched, the first real emotion she had seen from him since the day of the baby shower. I'm sorry about Grace. I truly am. I never wanted... Don't. Her voice was ice. Don't say her name. You don't have the right. Silence stretched between them. I'm here to offer you a way out, Marcus said finally. $5 million, a chance to start over. All you have to do is walk away. And if I don't, his expression hardened, the mask sliding back into place. Then things will get very difficult for you. Your parents will lose their home. Your reputation will never recover. I have resources you can't imagine. I can make your life a living hell for the next 20 years. Elena leaned forward. Her voice was steady, her eyes never leaving his. You already did. You made me hold my dead daughter in my arms. You made me bury her alone while you had dinner with your mistress. There's nothing left you can do to me. Everyone has something to lose. I don't. She smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. That's what you never understood, Marcus. You took everything from me, and now I have nothing left to fear. She stood. I'll see you tomorrow. What happens tomorrow? You'll find out. She walked out of the restaurant without looking back. Marcus didn't know that Elena was wearing a wire. Every word he had said, the threats, the bribery attempt, the intimidation had been recorded. The evidence was complete. Tomorrow, the world would know the truth. But the Carters weren't finished yet. At 11 that night, Elena's phone rang. Patricia Vance's number. They know. Patricia's voice was tight with fear. Someone tipped them off. They're coming for you. What do you mean? Marcus filed an emergency injunction. The website will be taken down by midnight, and there's a warrant for your arrest. Theft of confidential documents. Conspiracy to commit fraud. They're framing you. Can they do that? Donald Carter Sr. has 3 judges in his pocket. They can do whatever they want. Through the window, Elena saw police cars pulling up outside her parents' house. They're here, she whispered. Don't let them take the evidence. Whatever you do, don't let them... The line went dead. Knock, knock, knock. Police, open up! Elena looked at her laptop. The story, the documents, the testimonies, everything they had worked for over 6 months. She had 30 seconds. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. Send, send, send. The files uploaded to 15 different servers, 15 different journalists, 15 different outlets that the Carters didn't control. The door broke down when, Elena Mitchell, you're under arrest. They handcuffed her in her childhood bedroom, in front of her terrified parents, in front of the photo of Grace on her nightstand. They had taken everything from her, Barn. But they couldn't take back what she had just sent. 24 hours later, Elena walked out of the county jail a free woman. The charges had been dropped. Not quietly negotiated away, not plea bargain, down to nothing. Dropped entirely because the story had gone viral before anyone could stop it. She stood on the courthouse steps, blinking in the morning sunlight, as Rachel appeared at her side with coffee and an umbrella she didn't need. Have you seen the news? Elena shook her head. They had taken her phone when they arrested her. Rachel handed her a tablet. The headlines were everywhere. Every major news network, every newspaper, every website and blog and social media platform in the country. Tech CEO exposed. Multiple women accused Marcus Carter of predatory pattern. Carter family empire built on fraud, bribery, and abuse. 5 women break NDAs. He destroyed our lives. Recording reveals CEO threatening victim with retaliation. Wife of tech CEO lost baby after mistress announced pregnancy at baby shower. The story had broken like a dam releasing water that had been building for decades. 15 outlets had published simultaneously, each one adding their own verification and investigation, each one building on the foundation Elena and her allies had created. The evidence was irrefutable. Financial documents verified by independent forensic accountants. Testimony from 5 women, on video, describing the same pattern of seduction, manipulation, and destruction. A recording of Marcus threatening Elena at the restaurant. Patricia Vance's statement, corroborated by internal communications that proved she was telling the truth. Medical records confirming the timeline of Elena's placental abruption. The Carters had tried to silence one woman. They had underestimated how many women they had actually hurt. Within a week, the collapse was complete. Marcus Carter was arrested at his penthouse, still wearing the same clothes he had worn to the meeting with Elena. The charges included securities fraud, embezzlement, witness tampering, and bribery. His company's stock had dropped 91%, wiping out billions of dollars in value. All his personal assets were frozen pending investigation. He was denied bail as a flight risk. Donald Carter Sr. was arrested the same day. The charges against him were even more extensive: racketeering, bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy. 3 judges he had bribed resigned immediately, facing their own criminal investigations. Federal prosecutors announced they were expanding their investigation to cover his entire real estate empire. Veronica Shaw was arrested at JFK Airport, trying to board a flight to a country with no extradition treaty. The charges against her included conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to witness tampering. The FBI had traced her involvement in silencing at least 8 women over a period of 12 years. She was denied bail as well. The empire that had seemed untouchable just weeks ago crumbled like a sandcastle at high tide. 6 months later, Elena sat in a federal courtroom and watched Marcus Carter receive his sentence. He was thinner than he had been at the restaurant. Prison had not been kind to him. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his diminished frame. The confidence that had once been his greatest weapon had evaporated, leaving behind a man who looked older than his years and smaller than she remembered. The judge was a woman. Elena appreciated the symmetry. "Mr. Carter," her voice echoed through the silent courtroom, "you have been found guilty of securities fraud, embezzlement, witness tampering, and bribery. Your crimes did not merely violate the law, they destroyed lives." Marcus stared at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "You preyed on vulnerable women, silenced them with money and threats, and built your empire on their suffering. Your own wife lost her child because of the shock you inflicted upon her. Your daughter never drew a single breath because of your choices." The judge paused, and when she continued, her voice was heavy with contempt. "And even then, you chose to abandon your wife and dine with your mistress while she grieved alone. You have shown no remorse, no accountability, no humanity." She straightened the papers in front of her. "The court sentences you to 22 years in federal prison without possibility of parole." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. 22 years. At his age, he would be 60 when he got out, assuming he survived that long. Guards moved forward to lead him away. As Marcus passed Elena's row, he stopped. The guards paused, uncertain whether to force him forward. "Elena." His voice was barely a whisper. "Please, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I never meant." She looked at him without hatred, without anger, without anything at all. Just the calm, clear gaze of a woman who had already moved on. "You watched me bleed on the floor and did nothing. You don't get to apologize." The guards took him away. Elena didn't watch him go. Later that day, Veronica Shaw was sentenced to 5 years for conspiracy and fraud. She sobbed through the entire proceedings, claiming she had been manipulated, that she was a victim too, that she had believed Marcus when he said they would be together. The judge was unmoved. Donald Carter Sr. received 18 years for racketeering and bribery. He showed no emotion when the sentence was read, just the cold, calculating stare of a man who had spent 60 years believing the rules didn't apply to him and was only now discovering how wrong he had been. After the sentencing, Elena stood on the courthouse steps with Rachel on one side and Megan Holloway on the other. Cameras flashed, reporters shouted questions. The story that had begun with a pregnant woman collapsing at her own baby shower had ended with the destruction of one of the most powerful families in America. Mrs. Mitchell, how does it feel to finally have justice? Elena considered the question carefully before answering. Justice doesn't bring back my daughter. It doesn't, erase what happened, but it makes sure it never happens to anyone else. And maybe that's enough. She looked at the women standing beside her, Megan, who had broken her NDA and risked everything to tell the truth. Rachel, who had failed her once and then spent 6 months trying to make it right. Catherine and Jennifer and the others, who had found the courage to speak after years of enforced silence. I couldn't have done this alone, she continued. None of us could. They counted on our isolation, our shame, our belief that speaking up would only bring more pain. But when we stood together, they couldn't silence us anymore. She turned to face the cameras directly. If you're watching this and you're in a situation where someone is hurting you, someone with more power and more money and more connections than you think you can fight, know that you're not alone. There are people who will believe you. There are people who will stand with you. And together we are stronger than they will ever be. The interview ended, the cameras turned away, but Elena's words would be replayed millions of times over the coming weeks, becoming a rallying cry for victims of powerful abusers everywhere. Justice had been served, and it was only the beginning. 3 years after the trial, Elena sat in the living room of a modest house in Connecticut, watching the evening news. A brief segment caught her attention. Former tech CEO Marcus Carter denied parole for third time. The footage showed Marcus being led back to his cell after the hearing. He was 53 now, grayer, thinner, diminished in ways that went beyond the physical. The man who had once commanded rooms and charmed investors and seduced women could barely meet the camera's eye. Elena turned off the television. She had stopped following the news about Marcus years ago, but occasionally something slipped through. She knew in a distant way that his life had continued its downward trajectory, that Veronica had divorced him from prison after meeting a correctional officer at her own facility, that his mother had died while he was incarcerated and he hadn't been allowed to attend the funeral, that his siblings had cut off contact entirely, unwilling to be associated with the family shame. She knew these things, but they didn't bring her joy. They didn't bring her anything, really. Justice had been served long ago, and everything since was just gravity completing its work. The house she lived in now was nothing like the Manhattan penthouse. 3 bedrooms, a small yard, a kitchen where she could hear the birds singing through the open window. She had bought it with money from her book, Advance. The Weight of Silence had been on the bestseller list for 23 weeks. But she tried not to think about that too often. The money was just a tool, a means to an end, not a measure of what any of this had been worth. What mattered was the foundation. The Grace Foundation had started small, just Elena and Rachel in a cramped office, trying to figure out how to help women who were going through what Elena had gone through. Legal support for those fighting wealthy abusers. Counseling services for trauma survivors. Resources for women who had been silenced by NDAs and intimidation. In its first year, they helped 47 women. In its second year, they helped 200. By the third year, the foundation had become one of the leading organizations of its kind in the country, with offices in 5 cities and a staff of 32 people. Women called from all over America, their stories different in detail but heartbreakingly similar in shape. A boss who made promises and broke them. A husband who seemed perfect until the mask slipped. A system that protected the powerful and crushed the vulnerable. Elena couldn't help all of them, but she could help some. And every woman who walked into their offices broken and afraid and convinced that nobody would believe her, left knowing that at least one person did. That was enough. Most days, that was enough. The doorbell rang. Elena opened it to find Rachel standing on her doorstep holding a bottle of wine and wearing the slightly harried expression of a woman who had just come from court. The Morrison case settled, Rachel announced, brushing past Elena into the house. $4 million in a full public apology. Her ex-husband's lawyers folded completely once we showed them the evidence. That's wonderful. Elena took the wine to the kitchen. How's Jennifer handling it? She cried, a lot, but good tears, I think, the kind that come when something's finally over. Rachel had become a partner at a law firm specializing in representing abuse survivors against wealthy perpetrators. She was good at it, really good, the kind of lawyer who made opposing counsel nervous just by walking into the room. The work suited her in ways her old HR job never had. She was also, Elena was happy to note, engaged to a kind man named David who had two daughters from his first marriage and treated Rachel like she hung the moon. They sat on the back porch as the sun set, sharing the wine and talking about nothing in particular. These evenings had become a ritual over the past 3 years, a reminder that despite everything, friendship could survive betrayal and grow stronger for it. "Have you talked to Megan lately?" Rachel asked. "Last week. She finished her master's degree. She's starting a new job as a social worker next month." "That's amazing." "She named her daughter Hope." Rachel smiled. "Of course she did." They watched the fireflies emerge in the gathering darkness, points of light that flickered and vanished and reappeared somewhere new. "Do you ever think about Marcus?" Rachel asked softly. Elena considered the question. "Not really. Not the way I used to. He's just someone who happened, someone who hurt me. But he doesn't define me anymore. That's healthy." "My therapist thinks so." Elena smiled wryly. "It only took 3 years." 3 years isn't very long. Some people never get there." "I know." Elena's smile faded. "I think about them sometimes. The women who didn't make it. Victoria's daughter. All the others we'll never know about because they never found a way to speak. You're helping them now. Through the foundation, through the book, through everything you do. It's not enough. It's never going to be enough. That's not the point." Rachel reached over and squeezed her hand. "The point is you're trying. The point is you didn't give up. The point is you took the worst thing that ever happened to you and turned it into something that helps other people." Elena didn't respond, but she didn't let go of Rachel's hand either. Later that evening, after Rachel had gone home and the house was quiet, Elena took out her phone and looked at her calendar. Tomorrow was Grace's birthday. She would have been 4 years old now. She would have been starting preschool maybe, learning to read, to write, to navigate a world that would have seemed enormous and exciting and full of possibilities. Elena closed her eyes and tried to imagine it. The birthday parties with pink frosting and too many presents. The first day of school with a backpack and too big for such a small body. The scraped knees and hurt feelings and bedtime stories and all the ordinary miracles of watching a child grow. She couldn't quite see it. The images were fuzzy, incomplete, like photographs taken in low light. But she could feel it. The love she would have given, had given, was still giving to a daughter who existed now only in memory and in the work that bore her name. Tomorrow she would visit the grave. She would bring white roses like she did every year. She would sit on the grass and talk to Grace about everything that had happened since the last visit. The cases they had won, the women they had helped, the small victories that added up to something larger than herself. And then she would get up and she would go back to the office and she would keep fighting. Because that was all she could do. That was all any of them could do. Keep fighting, keep hoping, keep believing that justice was possible, even when the odds were impossible, even when the powerful seemed invincible, even when the darkness threatened to swallow everything. Elena Mitchell had learned that lesson the hardest way imaginable, and she would spend the rest of her life making sure other women didn't have to learn it the same way. 7 years after the trial, Elena stood at a lectern in a conference hall filled with 1,000 people, all of them there to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Grace Foundation. She was 41 now. Her dark hair had a few strands of gray that she didn't bother to hide. Her face showed lines that hadn't been there a decade ago. Around her eyes, at the corners of her mouth, the geography of a life that had included more grief than anyone should have to bear. But her eyes were clear, her voice was steady, and when she smiled, it reached all the way down to something genuine and warm. 10 years ago, she began, I was a kindergarten teacher who thought she had everything figured out. A loving husband, a baby on the way, a future that seemed bright and certain. She paused, letting the silence settle. Then everything changed. In a single afternoon, I lost my daughter, my marriage, and my belief that the world was a fair place. I spent months afterward in a darkness so complete that I wasn't sure I would ever find my way out. The audience was silent. Many of them knew her story. It had been told and retold in books and articles and television specials. But hearing it from her, in person, still carried a weight that secondhand accounts couldn't match. But I'm not here to talk about what I lost. I'm here to talk about what I found. She looked out at the crowd, staff members and volunteers, donors and advocates, survivors who had become helpers, who had become friends. I found that when you have nothing left, you discover what you're really made of. I found that the silence they count on, the shame they use as a weapon, loses its power when you share it with others who understand. I found that one voice can be silenced, but a chorus cannot. Elena gestured to the screens behind her, which displayed statistics from the Foundation's work. 12,000 women helped in 10 years, 347 successful legal cases, 52 pieces of legislation influenced, countless lives changed. This isn't my foundation. It never was. It's Grace's foundation, named for a daughter who never got to take a breath, but whose existence changed the world anyway. And it's your foundation. Everyone who ever donated $1, volunteered an hour, or simply believed that things could be different. She smiled. So I want to say thank you to my team, who work harder than anyone should have to the donors who make this possible, to the survivors who trusted us with their stories, and to everyone watching tonight who is still afraid, still silent, still wondering if speaking up is worth the risk. She leaned into the microphone. It is, I promise you, it is. They want you to believe you're alone, that nobody will believe you, that fighting back will only make things worse. But you're not alone. You have never been alone, and together we are stronger than they will ever be. The applause that followed was thunderous. Later that evening, after the speeches and the toasts and the photographs, Elena slipped away to a quiet corner of the venue where a single photograph sat on a small memorial table. Grace's photograph, the same one from the hospital, printed larger and framed in silver. Elena touched the frame gently. Hey, baby girl, big night tonight. I wish you could see it. She stood there for a long moment, alone with her daughter and her memories. I'm okay now. It took a long time, but I'm okay. I have a life I'm proud of, work that matters, people who love me, and I have you always. Every woman we help, every victory we win, every time someone finds the courage to speak, that's you. That's your legacy. That's what you gave the world just by existing, even for such a short time. She wiped her eyes. I love you, Grace. I always will. I'll see you next year. She turned and walked back toward the party, toward her life, toward all the work that still remained. Behind her, the photograph seemed to glow in the soft light. 10 years after Grace's death, Elena stood at her daughter's grave on a clear autumn afternoon. The headstone was weathered now, the letters softened by years of rain and sun. But the words were still legible. Grace Elena Carter. Never born, forever loved. Your light changed the world. Elena placed white roses on the grave, just as she did every year. The ritual had become as natural as breathing, a touchstone in a life that had changed beyond recognition. She sat down on the grass beside the headstone. Hey, baby girl, it's been 10 years, I know. I can hardly believe it either. She was quiet for a moment, gathering her thoughts. I want you to know something. For a long time after I lost you, I thought my life was over. I thought the grief would swallow me whole, and there'd be nothing left. Some days it almost did. Some nights I sat in the dark and wondered what the point was, wondered if I would ever feel anything besides empty. A soft wind stirred the leaves in the trees above. But something happened, something I didn't expect. I found out that I was stronger than I knew. I found out that there were people who would stand with me, even when everything seemed impossible. I found out that justice was possible, even against people who thought they were untouchable. Elena touched the headstone gently. I built something in your name, Grace, a foundation that helps women like me, women who lost everything and didn't know how to keep going. 12,000 women, 12,000 stories that might have ended in silence and despair, but didn't, because of you. She smiled. That's your legacy, baby girl. You never took a breath, and you changed the world. She was quiet for another moment. I have a family now, a husband who loves me, a daughter who calls me mom. I never thought I'd have that again. I never thought I deserved it. 3 years earlier, Elena had met Daniel Webb at a Grace Foundation fundraiser. He was a high school history teacher, a widower with a daughter named Lily. He had approached her not because she was famous, but because she looked tired. Long night, he had asked. Long decade, she had replied. And somehow, impossibly, they had both laughed. Their relationship had developed slowly, carefully, with all the patience that two people who have known loss can bring to something new. Daniel didn't try to fix her or rescue her or compete with a ghost. He just showed up, listened, let her be exactly who she was. They had married 2 years ago in a small ceremony. Rachel was the maid of honor. Lily, now 15, was the flower girl. And 6 months after the wedding, Lily had asked if she could call Elena Mom. Elena had held her tight and said yes. I know you'd want me to be happy, Elena said now, sitting beside Grace's grave. So I am. Finally, after everything, I am. She kissed her fingers and pressed them to the headstone. I love you, Grace. I always will. I'll see you next year. She stood. Daniel was waiting at a respectful distance, holding Lily's hand. He had come with her to the cemetery every year since they'd been together, understanding without being told that this ritual mattered, that this was a part of Elena that would never disappear and shouldn't have to. Elena walked toward them. She took Daniel's free hand. You okay, Mom? Lily asked. Elena looked at her stepdaughter, her daughter now, in all the ways it mattered, and felt her heart expand with a love she had thought she would never feel again. Yes, sweetheart, I'm okay. They walked away together, a family forged from loss and hope, and the stubborn refusal to let grief have the final word. At the edge of the cemetery, Elena glanced back one last time. The white roses fluttered on Grace's grave, bright against the weathered stone. She smiled, small, quiet, real. Then she turned forward and didn't look back. In a halfway house in Ohio, Marcus Carter sat alone in a room barely larger than a closet. He had been released 3 months ago after serving his full 22-year sentence. There had been no early release, no parole, no mercy from a system he had once believed he controlled. He was 60 years old. He had no money. Everything had been seized years ago, distributed to victims and lawyers and the government agencies that had picked over the corpse of his empire like vultures. He had no family. His mother had died while he was incarcerated. His siblings had changed their names and moved away. His daughter by Veronica had been adopted and didn't know he existed. He had nothing except the clothes on his back and a job at a warehouse that paid minimum wage. His days were monotonous. Wake at 5, bus to work, 8 hours of stacking boxes and avoiding eye contact with coworkers who didn't know who he was and wouldn't care if they did. Bus home, dinner from a microwave, sleep, repeat. He thought about Elena sometimes, about the life they had built and the way he had destroyed it, about the baby shower and Veronica's entrance and the blood spreading across Elena's white dress. He had written her letters from prison, 43 of them over the course of 2 years. Every one had been returned unopened, stamped with words that felt like a tombstone. Returned to sender. He had stopped writing after that. At night, in the moments before sleep claimed him, he sometimes wondered what his life might have been if he had made different choices. If he had told Veronica no. If he had confessed to Elena before it was too late. If he had chosen love over conquest, family over ego, truth over the comfortable lies that had seemed so easy to maintain. But those thoughts led nowhere. The past was unchangeable, and the future was a gray expanse of warehouse shifts and microwave dinners and slow decay. 3 months after his release, Marcus Carter died of a heart attack in his small room. He was found 4 days later when neighbors complained about the smell. His funeral had 6 attendees. None of them were family. He was buried in a county cemetery in a plot paid for by the state. The headstone was simple. Marcus Carter, followed by the years of his birth and death. No epitaph, no flowers. No one came to visit. The world moved on without him. In a small town in Ohio, Veronica Shaw worked her shift at a grocery store checkout line. She was 44 now. The beauty that had once been her greatest weapon had faded into something ordinary. Her hair was dyed a brown that didn't quite match her natural color. Her eyes were tired. She had served her 5 years and been released into a world that had no place for her. Her family had disowned her. Her friends had disappeared. The connections and opportunities that had once seemed limitless had evaporated like morning dew. Her son had been adopted by another family years ago. She had fought for custody and lost. The court ruled that it wasn't in the child's best interest to be raised by a woman with her history. She had been allowed one supervised visit. Her son, 7 years old, hadn't recognized her. "Who are you?" he had asked. I'm, I'm just someone who knew you when you were very little." That was the last time she saw him. Now she lived in a one-bedroom apartment, alone except for memories that refused to leave her alone. She worked her shifts, paid her rent, and tried not to think about the life she had imagined for herself, the one where Marcus chose her, where they raised their child together, where she was special. She saw Elena on television sometimes, giving speeches, accepting awards, looking happy and successful and whole. Every time Veronica changed the channel, she never apologized. She never spoke publicly about what had happened. She never took responsibility. She just disappeared. Some fates are worse than prison. In Connecticut, Elena Mitchell-Webb tucked her stepdaughter into bed and went downstairs to find her husband grading papers at the kitchen table. "How's Lily?" Daniel asked without looking up. "Asleep. She has a test tomorrow, so she's nervous." "She'll do fine. She's smart like her mom." Elena smiled at the word, mom. After all this time, it still felt like a gift. She sat down across from him and watched him work for a moment. The lamp cast warm light across his face, softening the lines around his eyes, making him look younger than his 50 years. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "How lucky I am." He looked up then, setting his pen aside. "I'm the lucky one. We can both be lucky. Fair enough?" She reached across the table and took his hand. They sat like that for a while, not speaking, not needing to. Outside, the stars were bright against the autumn sky. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening in an ordinary life. But Elena knew there was nothing ordinary about it. She had walked through fire to get here, had lost everything, rebuilt from nothing, found her way to a place she never imagined reaching. And she had learned something along the way, something important, something she tried to pass on to every woman who came to the foundation, every survivor who was still searching for a reason to keep fighting. The darkness doesn't last forever. The pain doesn't have the final word. And even when everything seems lost, there is always, always a way forward. You just have to be stubborn enough to find it.